Hi there, and welcome to the Stump. The video you're going to watch here is a interview with Commissioner of Public Lands candidates. There is no inherent or implied endorsement of any of these candidates, but given the role of this position in forestry here in the state of Washington, and quite honestly, a lack of understanding of what the role does in the larger population of the state, I felt it was important to try to get information out about who these individuals are. I have two interviews that are going live here today. I identified who the top five candidates were that I considered the most likely to advance beyond the primary. And three of those did not respond to requests for interviews. So please join me, though, in learning more about the two individuals you will see in the video preceding this little intro. There are two individual not chapters, episodes, one for each of the two individuals I interviewed. Thank you, and have a great day. Okay, all right. Well, welcome to the Stump, where I cover various forestry issues, career and personal development, and really anything else on my mind. I'm your host, Matt Comiskey, and today I'm excited to have Kevin Van De Wege, former or soon to be former state senator, joining us on the Stump. He is a candidate for Commissioner of Public Lands here in the state of Washington. And that position leads the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. And so, welcome, Kevin. Glad you could join us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I think to get started here, I think it'd be great if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself, your career, and maybe why you want to be the next Commissioner of Public Lands.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be the next Commissioner of Public Lands because I'm concerned about wildfire. You're well aware we've seen a growth in devastating and catastrophic wildfires in this state. That is something that I think is concerning to every Washingtonian. It affects every Washingtonian. The very least, you breathe in smoke in August and September. At the very worst, you're having your house burned down, and 350 houses burned down in the state last year. Many more were threatened, with ranches and farms threatened, and I don't think we're going to see an end to that anytime soon. I think that's going to continue to grow. I'm a career firefighter. I work up in Sequim, and I just hit 25 years in our union and pension this year. And I've also served in the legislature for the last 18 years. I represent the 24th district, the Olympic Peninsula, and have chaired the Natural Resource Committee in the Senate for the last 7 years. Always have been on that committee, and mainly because I represent a district that is really dependent on natural resource jobs and has a lot of timber activity. And I felt it was important. So I think both those things make me uniquely qualified to do something about wildfire. But also through that time, I've just learned about, all of the similarities that really the timber industry have with the firefighting industry. And that's been fascinating to watch and fascinating to see. And I really look forward to being successful here and getting into DNR and really doing something about on the fire front.
Yeah, okay. No, that's great. And I think that's, you may not know this. I spent 13 years in the volunteer firefighter service, and in a very busy, surprisingly busy rural department. So we were semi-urban and rural, but there's definitely a close nexus to the instant command system, how DNR is structured, and really kind of the opportunity of how you can lead complex agencies, complex events, those type of things. So no, I think that's really good, and I definitely think that shows some experience there of kind of how to do things. Plus, being in your role in the Senate, got oftentimes probably more education on some of these issues than you wanted to, knowing I've sat in front of you a few times. So, but yeah, so let's actually move right in, kind of maybe to the forest health, wildfire side of things. Outgoing Commissioner Franz, her predecessor, Commissioner Goldmark, they've worked pretty extensively to address forest health and wildfire. But what visions, goals, or maybe ideas you have to either maybe improve it, shift it, change it? I mean, really, in this role, you have a lot of latitude. So just kind of curious about some of your ideas there around the forest health and wildfire.
Yeah, so I do have some very specific points, but want to start by saying, I think in our lifetimes, wildfire's never going to be something that we can sit back and say, "Hey, we got this addressed." I think it's going to continue to be something we have to watch, we have to evolve with, we have to change our tactics and our strategies and what we're doing. Because I think it's only going to get worse. My real fear is in Oregon. I think they have set themselves up to have a tremendous amount of fire there, unfortunately, and that's only getting worse. So we want to work hard not to get into that situation. They've had some sawmill closures, and I think that's one thing we really want to prevent there. But the 4 points that I look at DNR are improving to improve. First one, in no certain order. First one, on the aircraft side, since you did mention the work Hillary's done, she has been very successful in securing more funding. A lot of that funding went towards aircraft. They have chosen, and this wasn't necessarily the wrong choice, but they've chosen the lease aircraft, which was a fine choice. But a lot of those leases are going to run out after this fire season, and we're kind of going to be back to ground zero. So I would like to look at the future of buying those aircraft so that we have those long term, um, and potentially even recoup some of the costs from those aircraft by having them fight fires in other states and provinces early in the season when we don't necessarily have fire here. This year, perfect example. They could have been, New Mexico was stuck, right? They had some huge flare ups and fires, and needed all the resources they could have gotten. Probably the aircraft that DNR is going to lease, we're probably down there actually making money before they come up here. But if we own the aircraft, we certainly could have been recouping some of those costs while fighting fire down there in New Mexico. So purchasing aircraft is one. Continuing with our sustainable harvest is another, making sure 53% of Washington forests are never going to be harvested again, making sure that that remaining 40% is as healthy as possible and in rotation. Any good firefighter will tell you the best way to put out a fire is to not let it get started in the first place. And I think on the forest front, that's reduction in fuel, making sure that there's, and a lot of environmentalists argue to me like, older growth or what they term legacy forests are resilient to fire. They're not wrong. And at one time they were, but as fire continues to change, like the forest they consume is also changing. And those forests that used to be really resilient to fire, I don't think necessarily are that resilient to fire anymore. I think we're going to see more hotter fires with more wind conditions that lead to bigger fires. So keeping up on that sustainable harvest, which also helps keep our sawmills open. It helps DNR generate their overhead. It helps fund, the hundreds of millions of dollars that DNR generates. So that sustainable harvest has a lot of pluses to it and is really important. Third point is increasing prescribed burning, mostly in Eastern Washington. From a legislative perspective, I pushed hard on DNR and ecology to increase that prescribed burning, and they've pushed back fairly hard. They have done some work, but they've pushed back fairly hard. Commonly, they cite a federal clean air permit. Geographically, Florida is actually smaller than the state of Washington, and they do 7 times the amount of prescribed burning we do, and they're still in the union. And I believe not only that, but I think they're still in compliance with their federal clean air permit. So I think there's room there where we can grow. We're doing about 10,000 acres a year Right now, that should look more like 100,000 acres. That would be a good solid goal to get to. And then the fourth point is increasing the relationship between DNR and Department of Corrections. You're well aware Department of Corrections has work crews. So right now they have three our prison our correction camps that generate three our work crews from three different corrections camps. I think that has a tremendous amount of growth potential there, both on the firefighting front, on helping with prescribed burning in the fall, helping with forest health treatments in the spring. Um, Numerous studies have shown that working in nature is one of the best ways to get over PTSD. A lot of the people incarcerated have some form of PTSD. So it helps them. It gives them skills because everybody that is at a correction camp is on their way to being released and being a member of community. Gives them skills, gives them some money so that they're more successful, and it decreases recidivism. I think it's a great program. I would like to see it expanded. So those are the 4 points that when I get into DNR, I'll be hitting on the hardest, the soonest.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, that's one thing I think I've seen kind of we have seen a kind of reduction in the correction camp
Yeah.
program. And I think you're right. Anything, even the mobile kitchens. I mean, what a
Mhm.
great way to give some of these folks
Yep.
practical skills that allow them to go out into the world and actually get decent paying jobs and,
Mhm.
hopefully not come back.
Right.
And deal with some of those issues. So no, I think that's really important. Of course, a lot about shared stewardship and the Good Neighbor Authority. If you see those as kind of effective tools to grow, maintain, reduce, kind of where do you see those tools going?
Yeah, I want to see a lot of growth in those areas. Um, I'm a bit concerned because I think in Washington we already have some forests that everybody's on board with harvesting, but there's no sawmills left to make it financially feasible for those to go to. And I think those and so I want to think outside the box and maybe DNR helps fund some temporary sawmills, like temporary I mean 5 years, where we're helping either in a private public relationships or a peer public relationship establish a sawmill or some sort of effort to get the forest harvested. And I think the Good Neighbor Authority is a perfect example of where we'll need some expansion to have any hope of being successful. Um, but the more timber we can harvest, the less there is to burn, and the more jobs and revenue are created, and the healthier our forests become. The eastern edge of the Cascades, Cle Elum area up into the Okanagan, I think are some prime examples of places that we can look and potentially have some success in doing something like that.
Okay. Um, Next one is how do you see you and your staff engaging with the legislature to ensure adequate funding for all this work? Because as you know, your role in the Senate, it's one thing to want to do it; it's another thing to figure out how to pay for it along with everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great question. And I think out of everybody running for this race, I think I'm the one that is in a unique position, and I have the relationships in the legislature where I've served for the last 18 years. There's 146 other legislators from around the state. I know every one of them. Often I know their families, have spent time with their families, have really good in-depth relationships, and I think that will pay dividends to the needs of DNR. I've worked on our budgets for many years, and know what negotiators are looking for. And I think DNR can do the most they can to flaunt what they're doing for the state, the revenue that they create for the state. There's going to be a lot of initiatives on the ballot this year. If a few of them pass, that alone, even if the economy stays steady, that alone will put the state in a financial crisis where they will be cutting. So like I would look at DNR going in there and not wasting a crisis. Like we always have to be on top, whether the state's doing bad or whether the state's doing good. The Department of Natural Resource can be an agency that helps steady budgets because they create revenue. And I believe one thing that DNR could do better is using that to their advantage, just showing how they can help steady the state no matter what's going on with the economy. And I really look forward to working on that. Yeah, some of the things I mentioned do cost money, and we'll have to work to get those funded. But if we can show that, yeah, there's an upfront cost, but long term, this is gonna save you. It's gonna provide more opportunities for Washingtonians. More Washingtonians are gonna be able to be employed and have jobs, and overall, that long term decrease costs to the state. You're well aware when people are unemployed, domestic violence goes up, drug and alcohol abuse goes up. People aren't able to fund their local schools and taxes. People aren't able to buy homes. So when the more we have people employed, the better off long term the state is.
And no, I can't disagree with you. And I think, it's, you hit on the one point of, the relationship side of it, and really, my personal opinion, these are issues that, they cross party lines. It's,
Yeah.
Really, you may have the 10% on each extreme out there that don't really want to come and work together, but most everybody figures out that smoke impacts everybody, and all the other social ills that you mentioned, domestic violence, all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, that affects all of us, and
Mhm.
whatever we can all do, regardless of party, I think is important to come together and try to work on. So, I think you kind of hit what I was going to talk about next, was kind of the next steps in addressing forest health and wildfire, because you already laid out your 4 points. But if there's anything else that you didn't get, I like, decisive, concise, to the point. Here's what I want to do. That makes it
Yeah.
so easy.
Yeah. Well, and one thing to add, and DNR is doing a good job of this. You mentioned you helped out in a fire department, so you're well aware. Like the equipment sharing DNR can do, which they do now, can be really vital to some rural fire departments. And so often they're first on scene, and if they're able to get there and be able to control and extinguish a fire using equipment that was donated to them by DNR, like that's a win-win for everybody. Because so often those rural volunteers that are serving their community are the first ones that are able to see the smoke, answer that 911 call, and get there. And I guess that's just an example of a program that we need to make sure we keep funding and keep steady. Like I said, DNR does a good job of that now. But I think that is something to keep an eye on, and in many circumstances has been a key factor in a lot of the successes Hillary's had, like the numbers from 2023, where 90% of wildfires were kept under 10 acres. Like that is huge, and those type of programs are what help make that a reality.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I was blessed to be in a department that covered an industrial park. So we had lots of money. And so we had lots of really nice new fancy equipment. I'd almost argue at times toys. But so we oftentimes went to help the more rural districts around us.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I travel the state, I mean, it's impressive to go into some of these really small towns
Mhm.
who I know, 2 years ago, they were happy to have a running 1974 brush truck, and now they've
Yeah.
got, one that's maybe 5 years old
Yeah.
and reliable, and and it's got all the more modern safety features and stuff. So I think
Yep.
that has been a really good program that, I think around the state, everyone can say we've seen tangible results, and
Yep.
it's a lot better than it just going to state surplus and getting 25 cents on the dollar.
Right. 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 And
So,
often when they go to state surplus, they're bought by individuals, then that contract back with DNR during high fire times, and you're actually paying them for equipment that you used to own. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's they're believe it or not, there can be efficiency in state government at
right.
times, right?
That's right.
So let's shift a little bit away from the forest health wildfire side of things. DNR is responsible for the implementation of the state's Forest Practice Act, and that includes not only regulatory oversight of private and state lands, but you also have the fun of the Forest Practices Board and policy and rulemaking. And we know over the last few years that the Forest Practices Board has become kind of controversial and I'd say decisive or not decisive, divisive. Boy, uh, sometimes my autocorrect gets me in trouble. So, I guess how do you see your role as Commissioner of Public Lands being able to kind of bring these diverse groups together to kind of reinvigorate, I guess, timber, fish, and wildlife, make sure the environmental protections are met while still maintaining a viable forest products industry?
Yeah. I think the first step of whoever is the next DNR commissioner, certainly am working hard for it to be me, but it's building relationships and getting to know the members of the board on a personal basis and really learning what their interests are, why they have those interests, and how we can get to a place where everybody agrees. And I look forward to doing that. But ultimately, I think it's also growing the advocacy on the part of DNR. A lot of work has been done to work with the beneficiaries of DNR's work and make sure that they're a sounding board. But I think there's even more growth there. Our fire commissioners need to be bigger proponents for DNR harvest. Our school superintendents and school board directors need to be. We have a hospital association in the state that is surprisingly large and in depth, but they have a subcommittee just made up of rural public hospitals, and they need to be more involved in advocating for DNR harvest because um, it generates revenue for them. It gives jobs to their constituents, especially, there is not a single rural public hospital that's not struggling in this state, and they're mostly struggling because not enough of their patients have commercial insurance. When there's natural resource jobs, they're more likely to have commercial insurance, and that helps. So it helps them on a couple of different fronts. So not only building relationships with the who's on the forest practices board, but also expanding and building those relationships with the folks that benefit from DNR's work and getting them all to work together and seeing the benefits of having a sustainable harvest are important, and I look forward to taking that challenge on and building those relationships. I would just end by saying, to Governor Inslee's detriment, often he was really passionate on the environmental side and often shoved through things or appointed people to boards that didn't necessarily always play well together. I think regardless of who the next governor is, I think we'll see less of an emphasis on that, and I think there could be some people that the governor points to some of those positions that are more in favor of doing bridge building and working together.
That that is very good to hear, and we will be keeping our fingers crossed because I know, particularly on the private land side of things and with forest practices, it can be a bit of an interesting dynamic these days. But so we'll turn to the trust lands too, because those are just some of the same challenges. Of course, they have a trust manager role and a fiduciary duty, and I guess kind of thinking along the lines of how do you see the undivided loyalty to the trust beneficiaries and their need for revenue? What are kind of your thoughts and ideas of ensuring that continues?
Yeah. And it again goes back to building those relationships, getting getting the people that DNR benefits from on board so that they can help spread that message of why a sustainable harvest is important. And then also kind of thinking outside the box. Since COVID, there's a lot of more Washingtonians that are interested in recreating on public lands. I think that is an untapped resource in saying, hey, you want to recreate on Washington lands? The best way to that for that to happen is to keep a sustainable harvest in place, because that helps DNR generate its overhead. And not all of recreation often is not included in that overhead. It's a general fund, but they're all related, and that money spills back and forth. I think that really is an untapped constituency that can help, that we can argue and work with to say, look, a sustainable harvest does a lot of things. The main thing it does is keep public lands open, which you want, and helps keep them clean, and accessible. So I think using those other groups that I mentioned, but also trying to think outside the box and looking and building those relationships with the mountain biking community, hikers and bird watchers, hunters and fishers, and ORV are a constituency that can be reached, and we can find common ground and look at new recreational opportunities that they can have through a sustainable harvest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing. I've never thought that recreation and active sustainable timber management are mutually exclusive. But also I think helping people connect to the understanding that those county roads they're driving on to get out to go recreate might have been maintained by money coming from the timber harvest up on the hill. So trying to help people, I like that idea of trying to help people connect all the dots. um as there's been a lot of controversy around some of the DNR timber harvests recently, and I just kind of curious what kind of steps you'd take or message you'd send to state land staff to kind of help boost morale, because I know as I interact with some of them, as you're as in any role you're in, when you take pride in your work, you identify as a professional, you're doing your best, and everybody's telling you you're doing it wrong. That can get a little depressing and a little down. And I think the staff is wanting to hear support and that kind of stuff. And so I guess kind of what message or how would you kind of look at helping with morale?
Yeah, morale is a big issue at DNR. I agree with you, and there are a lot of, as you mentioned, there's a lot of reasonings behind that. The first thing that I'll do as commissioner is go in and make sure that DNR staff know that they're appreciated. So often people that work at state agencies could be working elsewhere and making more money. So know that they're valued and appreciative, making sure they know I will always be there to defend them, and that they should feel comfortable in making their decisions and help leading and driving the agency forward. I think that is paramount. Explaining the direction that I want to see DNR go in and why it should go in that direction, and hearing their feedback and input from that internally, I think is important. Oftentimes in agencies the size of DNR, morale gets low just because workers don't feel like they're heard, like they have ideas, whether criticism or like a better way to do something, and they never feel like they're heard. So giving them that outlet is can oftentimes be just critical to making somebody feel valued and like, this is the reason I go to work, and helping defend them with those constituencies, whether if they're dealing with an environmental group or a NIMBY group that is, organized because there's a proposed harvest going on and they're getting a lot of pressure. going in as commissioner and say, look, if you have a problem with this, I'm the elected official. I'm who you complain to. These folks are doing their job. They're doing a pretty darn good job of it. But if you have a problem, you come to me. I think that can be something that's useful, and feeling and giving them the feeling like, hey, we're being backed up here, and that not only does that make them more comfortable with doing their job, but it also improves morale.
No, I think you're spot on. Having been there myself, and knowing what it's like to not necessarily know if those further up the food chain support you or not, even though you're doing your best to do good work. That's very important, and and I think that goes a long ways to having a successful organization. If you're got low morale, you probably don't have a lot of desire to go over and above and produce at a high efficient rate, and that's just human nature. It's
Yep.
so I think you kind of already touched on this one with your comments around sustainable harvest, but many of the communities, of course, obviously, where you're from, Clallam County, it's not just the revenue coming off of the state trust lands that's a benefit. It's also that economic activity that comes along with timber harvesting. Whether that's sawmills, loggers, truck drivers, all the support businesses and that kind of stuff. I guess, what are there any other ideas beyond the sustainable harvest you have that kind of ensure that the economic engines keep working in these
Mm-hmm.
communities?
Mm-hmm. I think I look at it like holistically, and Clallam County is a perfect example um, of just of trying to broaden that as much as possible, and paint that picture for constituencies where we're tying everything back to a sustainable harvest. That sustainable harvest does all the things you just mentioned, creates local revenue, creates local jobs, which are so important, and they are just vitally important. Obviously, you're aware we just had a pulp and paper mill shut down in Port Angeles. That's going to have long-term events. But tying that back and expanding that. So that sustainable harvest also benefits, like I mentioned earlier, recreation and those opportunities. A lot of people in Clallam County and parts throughout the Washington rely also on that tourist economy, and need to see those, Seattleites coming in and spending big bucks like that. That helps drive them. When you say, like, you're making your money off your hotel or your VRBO or your restaurant, or your tour service, like, that is also being supported. Like, those people are out there because they want to go see this place or walk on these trails or access these mountain biking areas. Like that, it's holistic. That is helping being funded by the sustainable harvest. That sustainable harvest is the bedrock here. And what I want to do is try to expand that and get people to realize, like, that all comes together, and it relies. If our sustainable harvest breaks down, our sawmill shut down, there's nowhere to bring logs to, and our forests become really unhealthy and start igniting a lot more, like, that tourist economy also goes down. People don't want to go and ride their bike through burned up forests. So it what I want to work more on is DNR being the messenger where this is all connected.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And, we've seen, in some of my work, lots of Ashford, Oregon, you know, not exactly the timber capital of the Pacific Northwest. And we've seen unlikely allies come out that are just like, livid over the fact that federal lands aren't being managed well, and the smoke is blowing in and affecting their tourism, and it's affecting, their grape crops. And so, I
Yep.
mean, I think you're right. It really does that bigger holistic piece of it, I think, is important, because I do some work with a guy up in East Lewis County, and we may not agree on everything, but one thing we really agree on is that a successful rural economy really kind of takes, three legs. You got to have that family wage job, manufacturing kind of, you know, sector, you've got to have that tourism recreation sector, and then you got to have a stable government sector that's helping support all of that. And to
Mhm.
me, the more we can get to kind of that model, I think we'll have much healthier communities going
Mhm.
forward. So
That's a really good point. I like how you phrase that, Matt. Yeah.
well, thank you. So state lands really, it's I always try to tell people from that have never worked in or with DNR, give them a little bit of grace. They are essentially a land management business within a state agency, and that creates challenges when you're trying to be a for-profit business. But it includes timber, agricultural, renewable energy, with of course timber being the biggest of the core businesses. But do you have any other ideas on like how you might stabilize or increase revenue or future success of the overall land management business? So not just timber, but the agriculture side of it, the renewable energy side of it.
Yeah. Um, I've been involved in agriculture my whole life. I grew up in rural Whatcom County. My extended family had farms. I've worked on farms. Like agriculture is a big. My first career firefighting job was in Sunnyside, which is between Yakima and the Tri Cities, in a very agriculture dependent area. And because of that, and because of my vision, a lot of agriculture groups have endorsed. Washington State Farm Bureau endorsed me. I've gotten support from the Wheat Pack and potatoes and onions, and just a wide array of agriculture support. And I want to make sure farmers have stability. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is when farmers are releasing from DNR, that they have long-term assurity, and that those leases are there and they can count on them. If a new renewable energy project comes in, we're not necessarily going to be pulling a lease. They have long-term assurity. Farmers provide us a public good. They grow food that we all need to and love to eat. So I think that is a vital component. Secondly, they do, and this really delves into tree fruit, especially. Like Illinois has gotten to the point where if there's smoke in the air in Eastern Washington, they don't allow workers to be outside working. Well, you're a tree fruit harvester. You can't be like, hey, there's a fire going on. We'll pick those cherries next week. Like that doesn't work. So they very much like my message around fire and working to control fires as much as possible, because their orchards themselves or their grapes might not be susceptible directly to the fire, but you mentioned Ashland, like the smoke can cause harvest problems and pollution problems on the fruit themselves. So they like my message there. And then we have more right now. We have more renewable energy projects being built or permitted or existing in Eastern Washington than we actually have transmission to move that energy. So one thing that I want to explore is those renewable energy projects are great, and Washington obviously wants to transform themselves into being more on renewable energy. I mentioned Governor Inslee earlier and the way he's permitted some of those. I think the next governor will have a different approach to that and hopefully have more stakeholder needs to be done in those rural communities in Eastern Washington where these are permitted, and have some local control and local input. But the transmission of that power is something that's where DNR can play a role. And having that go over DNR land does offer some long-term lease revenue to DNR. It provides some harvest opportunities, potentially in forests that would be really difficult to harvest, and it provides some fire breaks for when those if those forests catch on fire. So I think there's a lot of win-wins there for DNR with the transmission of those powers. That's why the IBEW, the electrical workers, have really gotten on board with my campaign, and it's because of a lot of those views. They realize that their workers are building those projects over there, but but we're running out of transmission capacity. Is the one of the blocks right now.
Yeah, if you don't have you got a massive tank of water, but you don't have the hose capacity to pump it through fast
Yeah,
enough, doesn't
yeah,
really matter how much water you got sitting in the tank. So,
yep, yep.
well, cool. That kind of comes to the end of my questions and stuff. Anything else you want to add or that we didn't cover or whatever's on
Um,
your mind?
yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate you doing this. You know, we're a few weeks away um, from the primary, and I think that'll be really telling in this campaign. I'm well situated, I believe, to get through the primary. The campaign's doing a big push, and I encourage people to check me out online. KevinForLandsCommissioner.org is our website, and there's information on there. We're doing fundraisers all throughout the state between now and the primary, and just working hard and doing last minute push. And I appreciate you having me on to be able to talk about my message and what I hope to do at DNR, and look forward to working with you more on it.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll see how November goes and hopefully we can have you on as commissioner elect or as commissioner sometime early in the next year. And so we'll see how all that shakes out. But thank you, Kevin, for joining me. And yeah, we'll have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Matt.